Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to Debra and Peter are doing a podcast with Deborah Alcott-Tyler and me, Peter Wallace. Hello, Deborah. You look very cheerful.
Hello, Peter. It's fake.
Yeah, you're like the swan. Yeah.
You can only see me from the neck up. Underneath,
okay.
It's like, shaking with fury and fear.
Anything the rest of us should be worried about, or just domestic challenges?
Oh, no, just life and all the things that occur, Peter. And they do tend to come at once, like buses, don't they? Troubles come in threes always, like buses. But then, so do good things. So, at some point, maybe 3 good things in a row will come. You never know.
Well, today's a special day for me for at least 2 reasons. One, and I'm wearing my Ebbsfleet United 80th anniversary shirt, which I think is a thing of beauty as football shirts go, don't you think?
Gorgeous,
it's rather nice. But unfortunately, Ebbsfleet United are currently suspended from the league because they're unable to pay their bills. And there's been a huge development around the site of where the football ground was, and lots of people have been sniffing around and speculating and pouring money actually into Ebbsfleet United, much to the irritation of a number of the other clubs in their league, believing that the whole area was going to be redeveloped. And then about a fortnight ago, it was called into the Secretary of State and the whole thing was turned down, which has been a disaster for everyone. And all of a sudden, the bills which are owed by the existing owners who are just trying to get out need to be paid, and none of the new owners have got anything like the interest that they had before this decision was made, and the club is stuck in the middle. And so there are many people for whom Ebbsfleet, and before them their predecessor club Gravesend and Northfleet, it's the most important thing in their life. This is a kind of crucial part of the community. And today we find out whether the club has managed to get its act together sufficiently to be able to satisfy HMRC and the league that not only are they able to get to the end of next week, but they can get to the end of the season. And unfortunately, I think it's quite a tall order to be able to prove that. Meanwhile, they've got this rather expensively assembled squad who are banned from playing any games. But so that's a sad story, but it may all, by the time this podcast comes out, be resolved and for the better. And the second thing that's special...
Hold on. I'll keep my fingers crossed, Peter, because actually, it is a bit odd because we need development, whether people like it or not. We need it to move into the future. But also, I'm not a particular fan of football, but I am a fan of things that gather communities together and that give people a purpose, and that get kids off the streets and into supporting a team and all the joys that come with that. So I will keep my fingers crossed.
It's a complicated story, and it will and is impacting significantly on people's mental health and well-being. I mean, we sort of joke about these things, but when Take That split up back in the day and Yardline were inundated with young people who were kind of, it really, really mattered to them. And this football club really, really matters to some people. So I hope there can be some sort of a resolution. And even if it means the club has to run on a completely different business model with a lot less money, if there's something there for the people that feels important to the community. But there we are. And the second thing is that today is the 40th anniversary of my first ever day at work in the civil service. I joined the management and personnel office of the Cabinet Office on the 18th of August 1986 as an executive officer. And I was being paid, and I remember, because it's most money I'd ever seen in my life, an annual salary of £6,681.
Yeah, that was my salary. Yeah,
right. Plus London waiting.
No,
and I wore a cardigan to work on my first day, and a tie, which I thought was quite smart. And everyone called me Mr. Wallace, which was a bit weird. And there we are. The rest is history, as they say.
How funny, Peter. Well, I'm, of course, and I think it's today actually celebrating 25 years at DSC.
Wow, Silver Jubilee.
Yes, it is. In August 2001, I rocked up to a hostile, unwelcoming environment. Yeah, so I told you that before.
Yeah.
And if you'd have asked me back then, would I still be there 25 years later, I would have said absolutely over my dead body. But the way I'm going, it will be my dead body before I finally do DSC. So yeah, it's funny though, isn't it? Because it doesn't feel like that. I feel I've learned stuff along the way, and I feel, a bit wiser in some things, but it doesn't feel like it's, it definitely doesn't feel like the same organisation. I mean, it's changed so much in 25 years. And I think, it's easy to, I always remember once when I was talking to my team, or some members of my team, about the trainers who do like consultancy and training and do sales. And I was talking about when I did that similar job when I worked in Just Society, which would have been, 30 years ago, more, 35 years ago. And I was describing what it's like for them and, what they ought to do, blah, blah, blah. And one of them very rightly pointed out to me, the job that we do today is nothing like the job you did then, even if on the surface it looks like that. And I thought, they're absolutely right. They're absolutely right. Those of us who dispense wise advice, we consider wise anyway, to others who are doing what we consider to be similar jobs to ours, actually, it wasn't the same job by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, obviously, you still had to create relationships and all the rest of it, but the mechanics of it was different. And so it's just made me really reflective of how, all that experience is past experience. And whilst it can be helpful, and you do want to pass on tips to folk, it's also important for those of us who've been around a long time to recognise that the world in which our colleagues are operating now is not the world in which we operated in. And I think it's easy to forget that. Been there, done that. Let me tell you how it all pans out. And of course, we've no idea. They're creating the future as they go along. Whereas when you get to our advanced age, Peter, we tend to be a little bit more focused on the past. The only one thing I will say that I think is good about experience is that that most things are recoverable from. That whatever happens in life, at work, professionally, personally, that most things you can recover from. And I think that's always helpful. Whatever situation you're facing, you always find a way through it. So it's useful.
Okay, well, that hold that thought, because I thought we should talk about Jason Arday and this tragic death, and someone who it looks like couldn't see a way out, and for a whole lot of reasons which we can't possibly understand in full, but took a decision which has had emotional implications. I mean, God knows, for his family and his close friends, but all sorts of other people as well, because of what he symbolized for good or ill in the minds of many people. So I kind of hesitate to raise it because it's complicated and emotional, and I'm not sure we kind of know enough. But at the same time, everyone's talking about it, and I do have some thoughts and reflections. But what's your kind of feeling about what has happened and what anyone could or should be learning from this?
Well, I mean, for me, it isn't complicated at all. It's absolutely pure, simple, clear example of racism in action, of how somebody's race has massively impacted the way in which his alleged misdemeanors or mistakes were hounded by. And you see that because you see that there are other, at Cambridge itself, there are other professors or lecturers or senior people there who have been accused of much worse sexual harassment, sexual assault, things like that, and have had nowhere near the same attention that Jason Arday has had. So, and I think that we have to accept that. We have to be honest about that. I mean, it's interesting because I was speaking to somebody else, a white man actually, who was saying, well, it's easy to just say it's about racism, but actually, that even though he was cleared by his original university that awarded him the PhD, Cambridge had reopened based on other allegations or whatever. And I'm like, but that's to miss a big point. I mean, I know I've told the story before about my uncle, who, when I was saying I never eat in the restaurants and hotels or go for a drink in the bar because of being hounded by unwanted attention. And he said he didn't, and I bet every woman experiences that. And he said he didn't think that was what happened to every woman, And then 6 months later, he came back to me and he said, actually, I've been paying attention now, and I now see that you're exactly right. That is what happens to the women. And I think it's because he'd never experienced it or heard about it himself. It was harder for him to notice it. Once he noticed it, he couldn't unnotice it. And I think for many of us, that's what's happening with Jason Arday, is that we are aware of how complex and challenging the world is to negotiate if you're a person of colour or you're a person of a different religion, any points of difference. And that once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. And so therefore, it seems clear to me and many colleagues, some of my staff and colleagues in the infrastructure group went to the vigil that was held last night, I think, wasn't it? In Trafalgar Square. So, yeah. But then, coming to me very blithely saying you can survive most things. You can, but some people can't for whatever reason. And so, but my biggest take on it is the accountability of the media. I think this is right, but there's something like after he resigned, so he resigned from Cambridge before they'd even completed their investigation, there were 118 articles in mainstream news reporting about him still. It's just that's just relentless. I mean, someone criticized me once on LinkedIn. I'm in pieces for weeks, to get that bombardment of negativity. Anyway, so that's what I think about it.
Yeah, so the weight of the coverage, it's difficult to conclude anything other than there is a racial dimension to that, and it's impossible to argue the other way. But just to say it's the racist press, the press are reporting a number of things which are deemed to be facts or fabrication, depending on your point of view, that have been amplified and promoted by all sorts of people. So it wasn't the press themselves that made up this suggestion that he'd raised over £5.5 million for charity. It wasn't the press that began by saying that he'd run 300 miles in 3 days or whatever it was. Some of these things that seems to have been kind of gathered together, taken on a life of their own. He's been a kind of poster boy that has seemed to be too good to be true for a number of causes who've been very happy to run with it, and maybe it's been difficult for him to get out from under some of that stuff. So as well as there being a race dimension to it, isn't there also an accountability issue here somewhere? And how do we distinguish between racist journalism and journalism about race?
Well, the fact that he had so much coverage has to tell you something, Peter. The coverage was clear. We don't do that same sort of coverage about white men in similar situations.
Prince Andrew?
Yeah, I suppose. But then I don't think you can compare Jason Arday, who was just a neurodivergently challenged individual who had some massive achievements and who had deserved his PhD from Prince Andrew. So I don't think you can take.
Well, and Prince Andrew, just to add to my, I mean, I raise it semi in jest. Prince Andrew, who has extraordinary resources and and support and all the rest of it, as opposed to an individual. Absolutely. Maybe Caroline Flack would be another example of someone where there was when are we going to realise that these press pile-ons? It's not the first time, is it? There are.
Well, I think, the whole thing is, it's like the way in which he was interrogated. So all this started really because of a chap who seems to me to be deeply unpleasant in his views about life, a chap called Nathan Kofnas. And so he's one of those people who believes that we shouldn't have diversity quotas, and that, if we didn't, there'd be much fewer black people And that's a good thing. I mean, he's incredible. He advocates race realism, whatever the hell that is, I don't know. But race realism is largely that, averages in intelligent different racial groups are a real thing. Exactly. But he was him. So he's the one who started all this thing. He went through Jason Arday's stuff and said, this looks plagiarized to me, this, whatever. So you have to question the motive of that individual, who already we know comes from a deeply racist. I mean, if he listens to this, I doubt he will, but he could very welcome to prove to me that it isn't. But an awful lot of all of this has been driven by this one individual. Now you have to ask yourself, why was he after Jason Arday? Where is the evidence of other professors who are alleged to have plagiarized, or where, things have been copied? And also, Peter, there's nothing new in the world. Here's the truth of a thing. Like, things people say often reflect and remind you of other people think stay. So I don't know. I think I have to say there are other arguments we could make about other people. But in the case of Jason Arday, it's so clear to me that, that Coffness was driven by racism and was out to get Jason Arday, whatever, and that the media coverage, possibly unconscious. I doubt they all sat down and said, well, we're racist and we hate black people and we don't want to be professors, so let's go after it. It's much more likely just to have been unconscious and getting the stories out. And of course, the stories became clickbait. So the more people click on it and they're interested, and the more outrage there is, and the more anger there is, the more they cover that particular story.
Yeah.
And it disappoints me so much that the media is important, it matters, but they always seem to slide off any responsibility for whatever happens. It's not their fault. It was in the public interest. It's like we would never deliberate. They never ever say, hands up, we got that badly wrong, ever. And I think, and that makes me super, super angry, because it results in people's death. Yeah. And this is not the only time, Caroline Flack, as you mentioned. So I'm so upset about it. I really am.
Yeah, and I don't want for a minute to play down the race element of this. Yeah. I agree with you. There clearly is an element to this, but I guess I also wanted to stretch into where you're coming to here about people do die as a consequence of these media pile-ons, and Caroline Flack did. And it's not so long ago that we had that story of the chief executive and the head of HR who were caught in a emotional clinch at a Coldplay concert, and everyone had a good old laugh about it for 24 hours, even though it wasn't our relationship, still kind of up for grabs. But they must have had extraordinary resilience to live through all of that. And again, they have I suppose you have quite a bit of privilege in some ways if you're a professor at Cambridge University. He was a CEO and she was a head of HR, but nevertheless, there's a pattern here where time again individuals are picked up to be
shot down.
So I have a little, I don't want to compare myself with any of these terrible examples, but I have been on the front page of The Sun in a story which was part character assassination, part nonsense, and part a truthful go at the salaries of senior officials in charities, but written in an extremely personal way, which required a degree of resilience to get through. Now, what you said, there were 120 or something, Jason Arday. So you can't compare one with the other. But there's some of this. Some of this now, I'm afraid, goes with the territory of being a leader, and you have to be ready for it, both in terms of the weight you attach to these sorts of stories and the support networks that you have around you
I think that's
to get through them.
The key thing is about support networks, definitely. I mean, I don't know how much Jason Arday spoke to his family or friends about it. I think most...
Well, there have been. We've seen some people saying that he was saying, "I cannot deal with this any longer. I cannot cope." It was there, and
it didn't stop.
stop.
And it doesn't look as if Cambridge University did a huge amount, of pastoral care for this very vulnerable individual.
Yeah.
But an individual who was made vulnerable. Actually, that's the point about it. He wasn't vulnerable.
Yeah.
He was made vulnerable. By the sort of hounding of him, which beyond all proportionate of what any decent human being ought to, or any human being actually ought to be subjected to. So, yeah, but it's it's this thing about like how much we accept the way things are, because that's the way things are. So I don't disagree with you, Peter. I frequently say to chief executives, this is a shit tough job.
Yeah.
And if you can't handle it, then don't do it. Go somewhere else because it's horrible. My friend Sally always used to say about being a nurse, if you can't handle shit, blood and death, don't be a nurse. And it's a bit the same when you're a leader, particularly if you're leading something that's relatively controversial. But Jason Arday wasn't that. He was an academic. He was, a speaker, a lecturer. He wasn't trying to, he wasn't out there, causing rallies and trying to lead an organisation. He was just I don't mean just, academics, of course, are fairly important, but it's not as if, but it's also even saying that, why should we have to accept that that's what happened? Why can't we fight back?
Yeah.
Why can't we start saying, it is absolutely okay to arrest people for spreading hate speech online. It is absolutely okay to police some of what people say sometimes if it causes genuine damage to others. It is okay to say that is not in the public interest. That's just spurious curiosity, and I think that's what I hate, because what I'm like, Peter, I can't bear it when people say this is just the way things are. I can't bear that. It doesn't have to be the way things are, and we need to do something about it. And what I really, really hope is that, as a result of this, there will be some sort of, seeing to of the mainstream media. Although I don't hold out a huge amount of hope for that, to be perfectly honest.
It is okay for us, particularly as trustees, but also as human beings as well, I think, to acknowledge that leaders are vulnerable and exposed. And if you find yourself in a situation where your cause or your charity is under attack and your leader appears on the face of it to be riding the waves and seeing it out, all the rest of it, that's by no means inevitable.
Well, some of us really affected by that coverage, Peter.
Up to a point. I was more used to it because it was in an area where I'd had some previous attacks on my expenses when I worked at the lottery, and the sector kind of came to my support and said, well, we're glad that he's spending money on travel expenses because we want him to come out and see what we're up to, not sit about in his head office not having a clue what's going on. So
we have your back, Peter.
And that, so I had a resilience which some other people didn't, that was A, born of experience, B, born of I probably do have, for whatever reason, stronger mental health and well-being than some others, and some of this stuff matters less to me than it might to some others, but also a support network both around me in terms of family, but also out and about in the sector. So I think our willingness and ability to look out for one another and to spot where individuals or causes might be under disproportionate threat, as you and others did in recent times around those who were standing up for and supporting refugees and unaccompanied asylum seekers, for example. It can feel very lonely, but you're not allowed to show it.
No, you're not. And, because it makes me think of, the charity folk who've been hounded. So Halima Begum, for example, when she was at Oxfam, and that horrible breakdown in the relationship between her and the board and all the stuff. I mean, that was, and that sort of thing's a nightmare because, people write about it, never knowing really the fact somebody says something to somebody. I mean, that's the reality about all of this. And then that person has that hanging over their heads anytime they want to go for a job interview, anytime they want to move forward. How do you explain away all of that, because you hear that, she was a terrible leader, but then you hear other people say, no, she wasn't, just people didn't like the change that's being introduced. I mean, it's an absolute nightmarish scenario, but it's just, it's not okay. And we have to find a way to control it better and to make it so that, people, I mean, the other person I was thinking about is Monica Lewinsky. Monica Lewinsky, even all these decades later, is still, being hounded to a certain degree about what happened with Bill Clinton, and a woman who was powerless and, in the thrall of the most powerful man in the world, did something that she might not have done if she'd have been older and a bit more experienced or, or less in thrall. And yet she was the one who was blamed the whole time. Bill Clinton got away massively lightly from that. Whereas this has hounded her whole life, Monica Lewinsky. I mean, I'm glad to say she's turned it into something powerful and useful. And then, of course, do you remember there was that story? Oh, and I can't remember now, but it's a woman who made a comment about something and she was on an aeroplane. And it's just some off the cuff comment on Twitter, I think it was. Then when she landed at the other end, switched on her phone, it all blown up and she was being shamed publicly for what she'd said.
Oh, yes.
Do you remember?
Yeah.
I can't remember.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
I can't remember the story. So any listeners, if you remember what I'm talking about, do message us, let us know. Yeah, and it's just people we know do that shit, Peter. Everybody says it isn't them, but it's got to be somebody. You know, some people are on Twitter, on LinkedIn, are, you know, saying horrible things or being mean or sarcastic or unkind or whatever, you know, and like all of us saying, well, it's not us. Yeah. Well, it is.
And it's okay to take sides in arguments if you are evidencing them and expressing them with feeling, but it's not okay to do so in an unkind and dispassionate way. So again, I sort of feel a little bit, look, we can't get to the bottom of all these embellishments, fantasies, intended or otherwise, that have been associated with where the story of Jason Arday ended up. We can't know, but the way in which those were expressed and treated, and the human being in the middle of this story gets missed, and that's what is so troubling and has led in such horribly dramatic consequences to someone who had a lot to offer not being with us anymore.
Yeah. People will talk about it, it'll be covered on Question Time, it'll crop up on Newsnight, it'll crop up on things, and nothing will change. That's how I feel about it. I feel like a massive sense of
some things could even get worse. So I think
they are getting worse already.
Yeah.
You know?
So earlier on, you referenced the value of diversity and different perspectives and opinions and all the rest of it. Now, actually, when I got my slightly in through the back door, my non-graduate job in the civil service on the 18th of August 1986, I had failed the civil service fast stream entrance exams because they required you to understand grammar in a very kind of old-fashioned way that was only taught at private schools and grammar schools. And I had a big chip on my shoulder about that.
There you go. That's the system working against you, Peter.
Yeah. But the system, I benefited from the system recognizing that they needed to improve the diversity of the entrance to the graduate, the people coming out of university who were entering the civil service, and they had this dramatic idea that they would try and encourage people from red brick universities as well as Oxbridge. This is diversity in 1986, by the way, not the sort of diversity we're kind of looking at now. But, you know, and I was in this civil service recruitment video, and I was a bit of a sort of poster boy for state school educated, red brick university opportunities to get into the civil service, and after a little while I got onto the fast stream. As a consequence, I still had to pass the various exams and selection boards and all the rest of it, and I didn't tell any lies about or distort what was on my CV. But there were people in the system who were willing to value things which I couldn't demonstrate in the way that some other people could. They were willing to take a chance on someone being a bit different, and quite a lot of that is what, rightly or wrongly, or to a greater or lesser extent, Cambridge and others were trying to do with Jason Arday, wasn't it? It's to give us access to more views and perspectives and lived experience. But I worry that might get lost in a kind of reaction.
Well, but it's also,
to all of this.
It's also because people misunderstand it. Because when you're thinking about being more inclusive and having more diversity in your board, you know, in your organisation, in your university or whatever, there's this background story that people are saying about the people who, you know, we want to attract in, that somehow or other they're not as good as the other people. What we're doing is, you know, if we just was purely to do it on merit, they would never get in. And of course, that's nonsense, absolute nonsense. But it is this story that we tell ourselves. So this isn't about saying that everybody's racist and horrible out there. Well, actually, we are all racist. That's the reality. We're brought up in a world that others are the people. We're also disabled. We're also all of those things. But what's more relevant, I think, anyway, is that the whole point is setting quotas, for example, for diversity. So if you say, on boards of trustees, 70% men and 30% women, and we need to set quotas of 50% women because it's a 50% population. What you do is, because you have to actively go out and look for women, you find good women. If you don't actively go out and look for them, you don't. Does that make any sense? And it's the same whether it's color, whether it's race, whether it's any of those things. So the underlying thing to all of that is to get us to get over our personal prejudices and realize that actually there is talent everywhere.
Yeah.
It's just we've always been taught or brought up to think that talent exists only in a certain demographic.
Yeah, and we've definitely had this conversation a little bit before, because I remember being in a conversation where someone said, "But what if we follow that strategy and we recruit a mediocre woman?" And someone replied saying, "Well, she'll just have to replace one of the mediocre men."
Absolutely,
which I thought was very good. And on
I
that
just want
note,
to say one final thing though before we go.
Yeah, go on.
One thing I will say to listeners is don't avoid talking about things like Jason Arday in your workplace. These are not things that should not be spoken about. They should be spoken about, and how people feel about it, and allowing people to have a voice and to hear what they have to say. I think it's easy for leaders to avoid these kind of touchy subjects because they're afraid of how people might react. But I think we should be having those conversations everywhere, actually, up and down the country, but particularly in charities. And that's it. My final word on the matter, Peter.
All right. Very good. Well, it's nice to see you again. And we'll be back next week with Ebbsfleet United, possibly in existence and possibly not.
Oh,
what a cliffhanger.
What a cliffhanger. Thanks, listeners.
Bye.
Bye.